I can't believe you, Dylan. Evelyn shouted, her voice trembling. You lied to me, betrayed me. How can I ever trust you after everything you've done? Dylan looked at her with pained eyes. I know I was wrong, Evelyn. I've lost you, but I'll never give up. I'll do everything to prove to you that I've changed. In the lavish setting of a grand soiree, Dylan Everett Adams, a young millionaire, stood on the balcony, his arrogant gaze sweeping over the city that sparkled like a giant sapphire. His cold, confident demeanor seemed unshakable, until Matthew Joseph Brown, an old friend, approached him with a glass of wine and a challenging smile. Dylan, you always say money can buy anything, don't you? Matthew broke the silence, his voice laced with sarcasm. Dylan took a sip of champagne, his expression indifferent. Matthew leaned against the balcony railing and pointed toward a figure sitting on the sidewalk below. A young woman, barefoot, dressed in tattered clothes, her weary eyes staring into the distance. She is your next challenge, Matthew said with a provocative tone. I bet you $2 million that you can't turn her into a refined lady and stay with her for 3 months. Dylan narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the young woman for a moment. He didn't see a person, only a piece in a game. Confident in his abilities, he smirked. You underestimate me, Matthew? Let's wait and see. Matthew raised his glass in a bold toast. Dylan remained silent, staring down at the scene below. The young woman seemed oblivious to the world around her. A small plastic cup beside her occasionally clinked with the sound of loose change, her entertainment program for the night. Pathetic, Dylan muttered before turning away and heading inside. Minutes later, he was on the sidewalk, just a few steps away from the hunched figure beneath the dim streetlights. As he moved closer, the glow revealed her tangled hair framing a face etched with exhaustion, yet there was a quiet strength in her features that piqued his curiosity. Her thin hands held a piece of cardboard with scribbled words. Please help. Excuse me, Dylan said, his tone more of a command than a request. The woman looked up, startled. Her blue eyes, dulled by hardship, held an unexpected resilience that caught Dylan off guard. What do you want? She asked tiredly, shrinking back slightly. Dylan smiled, a mix of condescension and intrigue. I have a proposition for you, something that could change your life. She frowned in suspicion but said nothing. I'm serious, he continued, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. My name is Dylan. I have money, a lot of it, and I need someone like you for a personal project. A project? She repeated bitterly, letting out a short, hollow laugh. Her worn teeth showed as she said, I'm not anyone's experiment, Mr. Millionaire. Dylan ignored her sharp tone, his voice steady and precise. I'm willing to pay generously. You'll have food, clothes, a place to stay. All you have to do is marry me for 3 months. The woman blinked in disbelief. You must be joking. I don't joke about business, Dylan said firmly. It's simple, a marriage of convenience. No real commitment. After 3 months, we part ways, and you walk away with more money than you ever imagined. She sat in silence for a long moment, processing the absurd proposal. Her life had spiraled downward ever since she had lost everything. But something about Dylan, his authoritative tone, irritated her deeply. Why? She finally asked. Why me? His answer was blunt. Because you're the first person I found. In this situation. Dylan's cavalier response almost made her get up and walk away, but the weight of hunger and cold kept her rooted in place. My name is Evelyn Nicole Thomas, she said quietly. And if I agree, how do I know this isn't some kind of scam? Dylan pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out and opened the back door. Get in, Dylan ordered. We'll talk somewhere more comfortable. Evelyn hesitated, but the temptation of escaping the streets, even for a few hours, was overwhelming. She climbed into the car, and Dylan followed, instructing the driver to take them to the nearest hotel. The silence throughout the ride was almost unbearable. Evelyn watched the city blur past through the window, while Dylan typed something on his phone. When they arrived at the hotel, they were escorted to a luxurious suite. Evelyn barely concealed her astonishment. Plush carpets, elegant wooden furniture, and a breathtaking view of the city created a scene beyond anything she had ever imagined. Dylan ordered room service to bring food and clean clothes. Evelyn remained wary, standing near the door, watching his every move. Pouring himself a glass of whiskey, Dylan spoke calmly. I have no interest in harming you. This is just part of the deal. A few minutes later, the food was brought in. Evelyn ate without hesitation, finally feeling her stomach settle. Dylan watched her intently, analyzing her every gesture. So, do you agree or not? he asked once she had finished eating. Evelyn wiped her mouth with a napkin and took a deep breath. How much is she paying me? $1 million, Dylan replied as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Evelyn nearly choked. The amount seemed unreal. With that money, she could start over, maybe even help others like her. But the thought of compromising her dignity made her uneasy. I need some guarantees, she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Dylan nodded. Everything will be in writing. My lawyer will draft the contract. You will have food, clothing, and a room at my estate. And the wedding, she hesitated. Tomorrow, Dylan stated bluntly. It will be quick, just a formality. Evelyn ran a hand through her hair, feeling cornered. Dylan's words sounded final, leaving no room for negotiation. Finally, she sighed and nodded. All right. Dylan stood there, satisfied. Excellent. Tonight marks the first day of the rest of our lives. Evelyn watched him leave the room, leaving her alone in the luxurious space. The silence that followed was almost deafening. She knew she had made a risky decision, but at the same time, she felt like she had no other choice. The next morning, Evelyn was awakened by a soft knock on the door. The hotel butler entered with a tray of breakfast and neatly folded new clothes. Evelyn noticed the attention to detail. Fine fabric, neutral colors, all tailored perfectly to her size. As she ate, the weight of her decision sank in. She had sold 3 months of her life, but the promise of $1 million made her head spin. Starting over no longer felt like a distant dream. Soon after, Dylan appeared, looking more polished than ever, holding a leather-bound folder. He handed it to Evelyn. Here's the contract. Read it, sign it, and we'll meet at the courthouse at 2 o'clock. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the terms and conditions outlining every detail of the agreement. Everything seemed legal, but the formality of it still made her uneasy. She signed, feeling as if each stroke of the pen marked a point of no return. The wedding was quick and emotionless, just a few words exchanged before an impartial judge, a couple of signatures, and it was done. Evelyn Nicole Thomas was now officially Evelyn Dylan. Dylan had no guests, only his driver and lawyer as witnesses. As they left the courthouse, Dylan placed a hand on Evelyn's back, guiding her to the car. She noticed that he did so not with affection, but with mechanical precision, as if performing a ritual. And now? Evelyn asked as the car moved through the crowded streets. Now we go to my estate. That's where you'll be staying for the next few months, Dylan said without looking up from his phone. Dylan's estate was as grand as Evelyn had imagined. The tall, wrought-iron gates opened automatically, revealing a long driveway lined with meticulously trimmed gardens. The house was massive, with white columns and large windows reflecting the sky. Inside, a team of staff greeted Evelyn. Dylan quickly instructed them to prepare a room for his new wife, while Evelyn remained silent, taking everything in. As night fell, Dylan invited her to dinner. The dining room was vast, with a long table illuminated by a crystal chandelier. Evelyn sat at one end, Dylan at the other. The distance between them felt symbolic, but Dylan remained indifferent, simply beginning to eat. How are you settling in? He asked in an almost casual tone. I'm not used to this kind of luxury, Evelyn admitted, glancing around. Dylan gave a slight smile. You will be. After dinner, Dylan walked her to the room prepared for her down the hallway. Their voices echoed softly until Evelyn stopped and turned to him. Why are you doing this? She asked, finally voicing the question that had been haunting her. Dylan crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. Because I can. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, feeling both anger and curiosity. This isn't just random. People like you don't do things like this without a reason. Dylan didn't answer. He only gave a small smile and walked away. Get some rest. Tomorrow, your transformation begins. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her room, perched on the edge of the bed as memories from her past began to surface. It wasn't just the grandeur of the estate that unsettled her. There was something deeper. She realized she had encountered Dylan before. Suddenly, a memory flashed through her mind. Years ago, she had sat nervously in a job interview, dressed in her best suit, gripping a carefully prepared resume. Dylan Enterprises. And the interviewer. Dylan. She recalled the cold look in his eyes when he dismissed her with a sharp remark. We don't waste time on amateurs. That humiliation had shattered her confidence. Her life had unraveled after that. And now, ironically, she was married to the man who had caused her downfall. Rage boiled inside her. How could he not remember her? Or did he remember and simply not care? Determined, she left her room and headed to the study, where she found Dylan reviewing documents. "I need to ask you something," Evelyn said, crossing her arms over her chest. Dylan looked up, surprised by the interruption. "What is it? Do you really not remember me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Dylan frowned in confusion. "Should I?" Evelyn clenched her fists, holding back tears. "A few years ago, I came to your company looking for a job. You humiliated me. In front of everyone." Dylan studied her for a moment, as if trying to recall. Finally, he shrugged. "I interviewed dozens of people every month. I don't remember all of them." His indifference cut like a knife. "Of course you don't," she replied bitterly. "We're all disposable to you." Dylan remained silent, but there was something in Evelyn's expression that unsettled him. He stood up and took a step toward her, but she turned away, leaving him alone in his office. Evelyn felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a cold arrangement. It was a chance to confront the man who had once crushed her. But she was no longer the weak young woman from years ago. The next morning, Evelyn woke up as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large windows. The heaviness of last night's conversation still lingered, but she refused to let it drown her. She got up, freshened up, and went downstairs for breakfast, where she found Dylan already seated, reading a newspaper. "Good morning," she said in a neutral tone. Dylan nodded, his eyes still on the paper. The silence between them was heavy, but Evelyn refused to be intimidated. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. "So what happens next?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Dylan lowered the newspaper and looked at her with a slight smile. "Now, your transformation begins. We have a team of stylists, etiquette instructors, and even a posture coach. Soon, you'll be introduced to high society as my wife." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "As if expensive clothes could erase everything I've been through." Dylan ignored the remark. "Next week's dinner will be your first test. I need you to be perfect." The following days were exhausting for Evelyn. From early morning, she endured endless lessons on etiquette, dress codes, and posture training. Though she hated the superficiality of it all, she began to notice herself adapting to the new environment. Meanwhile, Dylan remained distant but couldn't ignore Evelyn's impact on his household. She wasn't like the other women he had known. She didn't bow to his authority. One afternoon, as Evelyn practiced walking Gracie through the grand hallway, Dylan entered and silently observed. When she noticed him, she stopped and crossed her arms. "Enjoying the show?" she asked sarcastically. Dylan smirked slightly. "Just assessing your progress. You're doing well." Evelyn scoffed. "Glad my performance meets your approval, Mr. Dylan." Dylan stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "Why do I always feel like you're ready to attack me?" "Maybe because you deserve it," she replied without hesitation. Dylan paused, surprised by her honesty. Then he took a step back and changed the subject. "Be ready. We're going out tonight." "Where?" Evelyn asked suspiciously. "A private dinner at a restaurant. I want to see how you handle yourself in public." That evening, Dylan and Evelyn arrived at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Evelyn wore an elegant dress, drawing admiring glances, but she felt uncomfortable under the attention. Dylan, however, appeared completely at ease. During dinner, Dylan noticed Evelyn's nervousness. Her eyes darted around, and she fidgeted with the strap of her dress. "Relax," he said in a low voice. "You're doing great." Evelyn looked up, surprised by his encouraging tone. "I'm not used to any of this." Dylan leaned in slightly. "You'll adjust. Trust me." For a moment, Evelyn saw something different in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating man she had met before. There was something more human, almost vulnerable. After dinner, on the way back to the estate, the atmosphere in the car softened. Dylan calmly commented on her behavior during dinner, pointing out small improvements she could make, but without his usual critical tone. "You really take this seriously, don't you?" Evelyn asked curiously. Dylan glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "I always take my bets seriously." The mention of the bet made Evelyn tense up. She still didn't know exactly what Dylan stood to gain from all this, but the idea of being just a pawn in some game left a bitter taste in her mouth. That night, alone in her room, Evelyn decided to explore the mansion. She wandered through the quiet hallways until she came across a slightly open door leading to an office. Inside, a large wooden desk was covered with documents and papers. Curiosity drew her closer, and she began to skim through them. Among contracts and financial reports, she found something that made her blood run cold. A printed conversation between Dylan and another man discussing the details of the bet. So she agreed. One message read, It's only a matter of time before I win. Dylan's response was indifferent, almost dismissive. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. She had known Dylan's actions had deeper motives, but seeing it in black and white made it even more painful. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Dylan stepped inside. When he saw Evelyn holding the paper, his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Evelyn looked at him, gripping the paper tightly. "Is that all I am to you? Just a bet to satisfy your ego?" Dylan stepped closer, reaching for the paper, but Evelyn took a step back. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Dylan exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's not as simple as it looks, it's not." Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. "You toyed with my life like I was some disposable object." "Evelyn," Dylan started, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare justify this," she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk before storming out of the office. Dylan stood there alone, staring at the scattered papers. For the first time in years, he felt as if he had lost control. Evelyn could barely breathe as she ran up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. When she reached her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to steady herself. Discovering the bet had shattered every ounce of tolerance she had built over the past few days. "I can't stay here," she thought, as angry and humiliated tears streamed down her face. She looked around desperately, searching for anything that could help her escape. That night, while the mansion slept, Evelyn put her plan into motion. She dressed in simple clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she had gathered since arriving. Carefully, she opened her window, trying not to make a sound, and climbed down the estate's trellis. The cold night air wrapped around her as she finally reached the ground. Evelyn glanced back at the imposing silhouette of the mansion against the night sky. A part of her wanted to scream, to make Dylan feel even a fraction of the pain she was experiencing. But instead, she turned and ran, never looking back. The streets were empty, and she walked for hours, ignoring the exhaustion and the biting cold. When she finally reached the city center, she found shelter in a subway station, curling up on a bench and trying to sleep. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Dylan woke early and noticed Evelyn's absence at breakfast. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming she just needed space after their argument. But when one of the staff mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, a chill ran down his spine. "Check her room," he ordered, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, the housekeeper returned with a worried expression. "Mr. Dylan, her room is empty, and the window is open." Dylan immediately rushed upstairs and entered Evelyn's room. The bed was untouched, and her clothes still hung in the closet. He stepped to the window and saw the marks on the trellis. "She ran away," he muttered, clenching his fists. Wasting no time, Dylan grabbed his phone and made several calls, reaching out to his contacts to try and find her. The thought of Evelyn wandering the streets alone unsettled him. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him urged him to go after her, not for the bet, but for something new growing in his chest, regret. Meanwhile, Evelyn wandered aimlessly, struggling to keep moving. Her strength was fading, and her fever was rising. The exhaustion of the past few days was catching up to her, but she refused to stop. Every step she took was a statement of her resilience, proof that she would no longer let Dylan or any man control her. By dawn, Evelyn reached a small square and sat down on a wooden bench. Her hands trembled and her vision blurred. She knew she needed help, but her pride kept her from asking. Closing her eyes, she felt her body giving in to exhaustion. On the other hand, Dylan had begun searching the city streets in his own car. His eyes scanned every corner, every bench, looking for any sign of Evelyn. Guilt consumed him. He had never imagined that his actions could cause so much pain. Hours later, as the sun rose high in the sky, he finally found her. Evelyn was lying on a bench, curled up under a thin blanket, likely given to her by a kind stranger. Her face was pale, and she was shivering from fever. "Evelyn!" Dylan called, rushing toward her. She slowly opened her eyes, her unfocused gaze meeting his. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here to take you home," he said, his voice firm but laced with worry. "I don't have a home," she replied bitterly. Dylan scooped her up in his arms, ignoring her feeble attempts to resist, and carried her to his car. The ride to the hospital was silent, his thoughts swirling like a storm. He knew he needed more than words to regain Evelyn's trust. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed she was dehydrated and running a high fever. Dylan stayed by her side watching her sleep as the medical staff tended to her. A heavy weight settled on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he had lost control of his own life. Hours later, when Evelyn finally woke up, she found Dylan sitting by her bedside, looking exhausted but still watching her intently. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice still weak. "Because I care," Dylan answered sincerely. Evelyn let out a soft, dry laugh. "You don't know what it means to care about anyone but yourself." Dylan lowered his head, his hands clenched on his knees. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." She studied him silently, unsure whether to believe him. The next morning, her mind was too weary to process his words. Evelyn woke to the soft sound of footsteps entering the room. Still weak, she turned her head slowly and saw a nurse adjusting her fore. The sight was comforting, but it was also a harsh reminder of her vulnerability. Dylan was nowhere to be seen, which allowed her to relax a little. Not long after, the door opened and Dylan walked in, carrying a small paper bag. He was dressed casually, something rare, compared to his usual formal attire. His eyes were tired, but determination burned in them. "I got you something," he said, placing the bag on the bedside table. Evelyn just stared at him, saying nothing. Dylan pulled up a chair, keeping a respectful distance. "It's soup. You need to regain your strength," he continued, opening the bag. "I don't want anything from you," Evelyn rasped, her voice cold. Dylan sighed but didn't push. He knew that forcing anything now would be pointless. Instead, he simply sat there, letting the silence fill the room. "Why are you here?" Evelyn finally asked, breaking the quiet. Dylan hesitated before answering. "Because I care." Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. "You don't even know what that means." Dylan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent my whole life not truly caring about anyone but myself. But you've made me see things I never wanted to face." She looked away, her hands gripping the bedsheet. "That doesn't change what you did." "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "And I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon. But I will prove that I can be different." Evelyn remained silent. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds were still too fresh. In the days that followed, Dylan stayed by Evelyn's side, ensuring she had everything she needed. He coordinated with the doctors, made sure her meals suited her preferences, and even brought her books to pass the time. Though she was still resentful, she couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, as she flipped through one of the books he had brought, she found something unexpected. A carefully folded letter tucked between the pages, written in Dylan's firm handwriting. "Evelyn, I know that words aren't enough to undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I've never been one to admit my mistakes, but you've made me look in the mirror and see who I really am. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect." Evelyn read the letter over and over, trying to decipher the intent behind the words. Was there sincerity in them, or was this just another attempt to manipulate her? That night, when Dylan walked into the room, Evelyn held up the letter. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady. Dylan glanced at the letter. "It's my attempt at honesty." "Honesty?" Evelyn shook her head. "You used me, humiliated me. How am I supposed to believe anything you say?" Dylan stepped closer, but maintained a respectful distance. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm here. And I'll keep being here, even if it takes years for you to believe in me." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you." Dylan nodded slowly. "I understand that." The next day, the doctors informed Evelyn that she was well enough to be discharged. Dylan wasted no time arranging everything to bring her back to the mansion. Although reluctant, Evelyn knew she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived at the mansion, Dylan surprised Evelyn with something she never expected. He had transformed one of the rooms into a small art studio, complete with canvases, paintbrushes, and paints in every color. "What is this?" she asked, stunned. "You once mentioned that you liked painting," Dylan said with a shy smile. "I thought you might enjoy having your own space." Evelyn was speechless. It was a simple yet deeply meaningful gesture. For the first time, she saw something in Dylan beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the days that followed, Evelyn began spending more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Dylan, for his part, kept a respectful distance, quietly ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Evelyn was painting, Dylan appeared at the doorway, silently watching her. "You're really talented," he finally said. Evelyn paused, looking at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." Dylan shrugged, a slight smile playing on his lips. He was learning to accept her first genuine smile after what felt like an eternity. Life at the mansion settled into a quieter rhythm. Evelyn spent most of her time in the studio, while Dylan remained busy with his business. There was an unspoken truce between them, a fragile balance neither dared to break. Except Dylan wasn't satisfied. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild Evelyn's trust. He needed actions to prove he was willing to change, not just for her but for himself. One afternoon, Dylan walked into the studio while Evelyn was focused on a new painting. He waited for her to acknowledge him, but she deliberately kept working, ignoring him. "I need your help," he said, finally breaking the silence. Evelyn stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Dylan nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you can help me decide where." She eyed him skeptically. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realized the world doesn't revolve around me," he admitted honestly. Evelyn hesitated. Though she didn't want to believe him, the idea of doing something meaningful intrigued her. "All right," she finally said, "but I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Dylan replied with a small smile. In the days that followed, Dylan and Evelyn began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to rehabilitation centers and schools in underprivileged areas. With each visit, Evelyn noticed a change in Dylan's interactions with people. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and understanding their needs. One visit, in particular, left a strong impact. They went to a shelter for women who had survived domestic violence. While Evelyn spoke with some of the residents, Dylan approached a young woman holding a baby. He knelt to her level and gently asked about her story. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the young woman said, holding her baby tighter. Dylan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand." Evelyn watched from a distance, surprised. She hadn't expected Dylan to show such genuine empathy. On the drive home, the car was heavy with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Evelyn sensed that something was shifting in Dylan, though there was still a barrier preventing her from fully trusting him. One evening, Dylan decided to take a bold step. He arranged a special dinner just for the two of them. The dining room was decorated with candles and flowers, and soft music played in the background. "What is this?" Evelyn asked as she entered. "A thank you," Dylan replied, pulling out a chair for her, "for helping me these past few days." Evelyn hesitated, but eventually sat down. The dinner was unlike any they had shared before. Dylan was more open, sharing stories about his childhood and how he had grown up in a cold environment where emotions were seen as weakness. "I think that's why I've always used money as a shield," he admitted, staring into his glass of wine. "It was easier than dealing with real people." Evelyn listened in silence, absorbing every word. She had never imagined Dylan would admit something like this. "And now," she finally asked, "what do you want?" Dylan looked up, meeting her gaze. "I want to be better. Maybe one day you could respect me." She was silent for a long moment before replying. "That's not just up to you, Dylan." "I know," he said with a sigh, "but I'll keep trying." After dinner, as Dylan cleared the table, Evelyn went to her studio and picked up a small canvas she had been working on for the past few days. It was a peaceful landscape, an open field under a sunset sky. "Here," she said, handing the painting to Dylan. He looked at it, surprised by its beauty. "I thought you might like it," Evelyn said with a small shrug. Dylan smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. In the days that followed, Dylan continued to show small changes in his behavior. He treated the mansion staff with more respect, listened more attentively to his employees at work, and spent more time on social projects. He and Evelyn had begun. The next day, the doctors informed Evelyn that she was well enough to be discharged. Dylan wasted no time arranging everything to bring her back to the mansion. Although reluctant, Evelyn knew she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived at the mansion, Dylan surprised Evelyn with something she never expected. He had transformed one of the rooms into a small art studio, complete with canvases, paintbrushes, and paints in every color. "What is this?" she asked, stunned. "You once mentioned that you liked painting," Dylan said with a shy smile. "I thought you might enjoy having your own space." Evelyn was speechless. It was a simple yet deeply meaningful gesture. For the first time, she saw something in Dylan beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the following days, Evelyn began spending more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom, something she hadn't felt in years. Dylan, for his part, maintained a respectful distance, silently ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Evelyn painted, Dylan appeared at the doorway, silently watching her. "You're really talented," he finally said. Evelyn paused, looking at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." Dylan shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. He was learning to accept the first genuine smile from her after what felt like an eternity. Life at the mansion settled into a quieter rhythm. Evelyn spent most of her time in the art room, while Dylan remained occupied with his business. There was an unspoken truce between them, a fragile balance that neither dared to break. Except for Dylan. He wasn't satisfied. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild Evelyn's trust. He needed actions, proof that he was willing to change, not just for her, but for himself. One afternoon, Dylan stepped into the studio while Evelyn was focused on a new painting. He waited for her to acknowledge him, but she continued working, deliberately ignoring him. "I need your help," he finally said, breaking the silence. Evelyn stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" Dylan nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you could help me decide where to begin." She eyed him skeptically. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realized the world doesn't revolve around me," he answered. Honestly. Evelyn hesitated for a moment. Although she didn't want to believe him, the idea of doing something meaningful intrigued her. "All right," she finally said. "But I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Dylan replied with a small smile. In the days that followed, Dylan and Evelyn began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to rehabilitation centers and schools in underprivileged areas. With each visit, Evelyn noticed something different about Dylan. He genuinely wanted to listen to people's stories and understand their needs. One visit, in particular, had a profound impact. They went to a shelter for women who had survived domestic violence. While Evelyn spoke with some of the residents, Dylan approached a young woman holding a baby. He crouched down to her level and began asking about her story. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the young woman said, clutching her baby tighter. Dylan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand." Evelyn watched from a distance, surprised. She hadn't expected Dylan to show such genuine empathy. On the way home, the car ride was heavy with silence, but not an uncomfortable one. Evelyn felt that something was changing in Dylan, though there was still a barrier preventing her from fully trusting him. One evening, Dylan made a bold move. He arranged a special dinner for just the two of them. The dining room was adorned with candles and flowers, and soft music played in the background. "What is this?" Evelyn asked as she walked in. "A thank you," Dylan replied, pulling out a chair for her, "for helping me these past few days." Evelyn hesitated, but eventually sat down. The dinner was unlike any they had shared before. Dylan was more open, sharing stories about his childhood and how he had grown up in a cold environment where emotions were seen as weakness. "I think that's why I always used money as a shield," he admitted, staring at his wine glass. "It was easier than dealing with real people." Evelyn listened in silence, absorbing every word. She had never imagined Dylan would admit something like this. "And now," she finally asked, "what do you want?" Dylan looked up, locking eyes with her. "I want to be a better man. Maybe one day you can respect me." She remained silent for a long time before responding. "That doesn't depend on just you, Dylan." "I know," he said with a sigh, "but I'll keep trying." After dinner, as Dylan cleared the table, Evelyn went to her studio and picked up a small canvas she had been working on for the past few days. It was a peaceful landscape, with open fields and a sunset sky. "Here," she said, handing him the painting. He looked at it, surprised by its beauty. "I thought you might like it," Evelyn said with a small shrug. Dylan smiled, truly moved by the gesture. In the days that followed, Dylan continued to show small changes in his behavior. He treated the mansion staff with more respect, listened to suggestions from his employees at the company, and dedicated more time to social projects. Evelyn also began lowering her defenses. Though she was cautious, knowing that trusting Dylan again would be a long and complicated process, something inside her was starting to shift. One afternoon, as they walked through the mansion's garden, Dylan suddenly stopped and looked at Evelyn. "I want to show you something," he said. Curious, she followed him to a small cabin at the back of the estate. When they stepped inside, Evelyn saw that the space was filled with mementos, photos from Dylan's childhood, old toys, and even drawings he had made as a child. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said as she explored the space. Evelyn picked up one of the photos and saw a young Dylan beside an elegant woman, whom she assumed was his mother. "You had a different life than I imagined," she remarked. Dylan gave a sad smile. My mother always said money could buy many things, but never happiness. I think it took me a long time to understand that. Evelyn placed the photo back on the shelf and turned to him. Maybe there's still time to learn. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as Evelyn slowly walked through the garden. The past few days had been intense, filled with unexpected moments. She could feel something changing inside her, though there was still an unshakable barrier preventing her from letting her guard down. That evening, Dylan appeared in the art room as Evelyn finished a new painting. He seemed hesitant, something unusual for a man who always exuded confidence. "Can I come in?" he asked almost shyly. Evelyn looked at him for a moment before nodding. Dylan stepped inside and slowly approached her, admiring the painting she was working on. "It's beautiful," he said, referring to the landscape she was painting. "Thank you," Evelyn replied, still focused on her work. Dylan took a deep breath before continuing. "I need to tell you something I've never shared with anyone." Evelyn put down her brush and turned to him, curious. "I'm listening." Dylan paced the room, his hands in his pockets as if gathering courage. "When I was young, my mother was the only connection I had to the real world. My father was a cold man who believed success came before everything, even family. He taught me to be ruthless, to never show weakness." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "My mother was the opposite. She believed love and compassion were more important than any amount of money. But she died when I was 12. After that, my father made sure I became the man he wanted me to be, cold, calculating, and driven by numbers." Evelyn listened intently, absorbing every word. There was something deeply painful in the way he spoke about his past. "And now," she asked gently, "do you still think you need to be that man?" Dylan shook his head slowly. "No. You've shown me that life is more than what I was taught to see." With Dylan's support, Lily received a scholarship and financial aid. Evelyn felt a warmth in her heart as she saw the joy in the young woman's eyes. It was as if, by helping her, Evelyn was also healing a part of herself. That evening, back at the estate, Evelyn sat in the living room, watching the fire crackling in the fireplace. Dylan entered and sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Today was special," he said, breaking the silence. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, it was." They sat in silence for a while before Dylan spoke again. "Evelyn, can I ask you something?" She looked at him, waiting. "Do you think we still have a chance?" Evelyn felt her heart race. It was a difficult question, but she knew she had to be honest. "I don't know, Dylan. I think we still have a lot to work through." Dylan nodded, accepting her answer without protest. He knew that if there was still hope, he would have to continue proving to her that he was willing to change. The days passed slowly, but life at Dylan's estate began to find its rhythm. Evelyn became increasingly involved in social projects, and Dylan continued to show small yet meaningful changes in his behavior. Although the emotional distance between them started to shrink, Evelyn remained hesitant, still unable to fully trust him. One sunny afternoon, Dylan invited Evelyn for a walk in the garden. At first, she hesitated, but eventually agreed. As they strolled among the flowers, Dylan spoke about a new project, building a community center to provide education and vocational training for those in vulnerable situations. "I want you to lead this project with me," he said, offering an encouraging smile. Evelyn stopped, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Dylan replied. "You understand the needs of these people better than anyone, and I want you to know that I trust you." She remained silent for a moment, considering his words. Though a part of her still harbored doubt, she couldn't ignore the warmth growing in her heart. "I'll think about it," she finally said. Dylan nodded, respecting her need for time. Later that day, while Evelyn was in the art studio, she received an unexpected call. It was from Amelia, an old friend from her time living on the streets. Amelia's emotional voice stirred a mix of nostalgia and joy within Evelyn. "Evelyn, I heard you're doing well now and working on social projects. I need to see you," Amelia said, almost breathless. Evelyn arranged to meet her at a cafe downtown the next day. When she told Dylan about the meeting, he insisted on going with her. "I won't interfere, but I want to make sure you're safe," he said seriously. Evelyn rolled her eyes but accepted his offer. The next day, as she waited for Amelia at the cafe, Evelyn felt a bit anxious. It had been years since they last saw each other, and she didn't know what to expect. When Amelia finally arrived, they embraced warmly, reminiscing about the hardships they had once shared. "You've changed, Evelyn," Amelia remarked after a few minutes of conversation. "You seem stronger." "I'm still learning," Evelyn replied with a modest smile. As they talked, Evelyn noticed Dylan sitting discreetly at a nearby table. Though he was only there to ensure her safety, his presence gave her an unexpected sense of comfort. On the way back to the estate, Evelyn broke the silence. "Thank you for bringing me here today." Dylan smiled, surprised by her sudden gratitude. "No need to thank me," he said. "But I want to thank you." He insisted. "You're different, and I can see it." Evelyn glanced at him, studying his expression. "And you? Do you think you've changed?" Dylan was silent for a moment before answering. "I just want to do the right thing, Evelyn." The sincerity in his voice made Evelyn's heart waver. Though she wanted to deny it, she couldn't ignore the truth. Dylan had truly changed. However, everything changed when Matthew, the friend who had originally proposed the bet, unexpectedly reappeared. He showed up at the mansion unannounced, a mocking smile on his face. "Dylan, how's life with your new wife?" he asked in a taunting tone. Evelyn, who was in the garden, froze upon hearing his voice. She decided to quietly move closer and hide behind a column to listen. "Do you want to place another bet, Matthew?" Dylan asked, clearly irritated. "Oh, I'm just curious. After all, the bet is almost over, isn't it? You must be looking forward to claiming your $2 million. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She knew about the bet, but hearing Matthew speak about it so casually reopened an old wound she had been trying to heal. "The bet doesn't matter anymore," Dylan replied firmly. "I've canceled it." Matthew let out a disbelieving laugh. "Canceled? You must be joking." "I'm not," Dylan said, his tone serious. "I don't need the money, and I certainly don't need the bet." Matthew looked at him in surprise. "So you've actually fallen for her?" Dylan didn't answer, but his expression said it all. Evelyn, her heart torn between anger and confusion, stepped out from her hiding spot. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dylan turned abruptly, startled to see her. "Evelyn, I can explain." "I don't want an explanation, Dylan. I want the truth," she interrupted, her eyes welling up with tears. Sensing the tension, Matthew took a step back, looking uncomfortable. "I think I'll leave you two to sort this out." As he walked away, Dylan tried to reach for Evelyn, but she took a step back. "Did you really cancel the bet?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes, I did." "Why?" Dylan took a deep breath. "Because you matter more than any stupid challenge." Evelyn stood still, her emotions in turmoil. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being made a fool of again was too great. "I don't know if I can trust you, Dylan. After everything," she finally said. "Then don't trust me," he responded, his tone calm yet resolute. "Just watch. Let my actions prove my words." She studied him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. Though doubt remained, something inside her told her he was telling the truth. The days following Evelyn and Dylan's confrontation were tense. Evelyn spent hours in her studio, trying to sort through her thoughts, while Dylan remained determined to prove his sincerity. Although an emotional distance still lingered between them, it was impossible to ignore the noticeable change in Dylan. One morning, Evelyn sat on the terrace with a cup of tea, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Her restless mind drifted between painful memories of the past and recent moments of genuine connection with Dylan. She knew she had to make a decision soon, but the fear of trusting again paralyzed her. Dylan appeared in the doorway, hesitant. He held a folder in his hands, his expression serious but devoid of the arrogance she once associated with him. "Can I join you?" he asked, respecting the space she so dearly valued. Evelyn nodded slightly, and Dylan sat down at the table, placing the folder between them. "I brought this for you," he said, opening it carefully and pulling out a set of documents. "This is proof that I ended the bet. There's no connection between me and Matthew anymore." Evelyn took the papers and read them carefully. The signatures and dates confirmed that Dylan had returned the money from the bet and had even donated a substantial amount to charity. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I want you to know I'm being honest. I don't expect you to trust me immediately, but I want you to see that I'm trying to be a different man." Evelyn set the papers aside and looked out at the horizon. She knew Dylan was making an effort, but the wound from his betrayal still ached. "You want to be different, but that doesn't change what happened," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "It doesn't," Dylan admitted, leaning slightly forward. "But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Evelyn knew that sooner or later, she would have to confront her own feelings about Dylan. In the days that followed, Dylan continued to respect Evelyn's space while proving his change through concrete actions. He became deeply involved in social projects, visiting communities and listening to the stories of those benefiting from the initiatives. Evelyn, though still cautious, couldn't help but notice his genuine dedication. One afternoon, during a visit to a shelter for at-risk teenagers, a young girl named Lucy approached Evelyn. The 16-year-old was pregnant and utterly desperate. "I don't know how I'm going to take care of my baby," Lucy admitted, tears streaming down her face. Evelyn's heart ached. She sat beside the girl and held her hand. "You're not alone," she said. "We'll help you figure this out." Dylan watched from a distance, admiring how effortlessly Evelyn connected with people. After that visit, he decided it was time to take an important step. That evening, he arranged a special dinner at the villa, just for the two of them. The dining room was adorned with candles and flowers, with soft music playing in the background. When Evelyn stepped inside, she paused, surprised by the warm and inviting atmosphere. "What is this?" she asked, looking at Dylan, who stood beside the table. "A way to thank you for everything you've done," he replied, pulling out a chair for her. Reluctantly, Evelyn sat down, observing Dylan's every move. He seemed weaker than ever, yet more determined. The dinner began in silence, but gradually, Dylan started to open up. He shared stories about his childhood, the challenges of growing up under the shadow of a strict father, and how losing his mother had shaped him. "I used money as a way to avoid pain," he admitted, looking straight at Evelyn. "But now I see that it turned me into someone I never wanted to become." Evelyn listened intently, torn between empathy and doubt. She could tell Dylan was being sincere, but she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. "I want to believe you, Dylan," she finally said, "but part of me is still afraid." Dylan nodded, accepting her words without protest. "I understand," he said, "and I will keep trying. I won't give up on proving that I am worthy of your trust." After dinner, Dylan walked Evelyn to her art studio. Before saying goodbye, he pulled something from his pocket, a small silver butterfly pendant. "My mother gave this to me when I was a child," he said, handing it to her. "She always said that butterflies symbolize transformation. I want you to keep it as a reminder that we all have the ability to change." Evelyn took the pendant, feeling the symbolic weight of the gift. For a moment, she was speechless, but then she looked at Dylan and gave a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to notice small changes within herself. Though she kept her distance from Dylan, moments of connection started happening naturally. A casual conversation in the garden, a glance exchanged during a meeting. These small gestures suggested that the barrier between them was beginning to fade. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, Dylan suddenly stopped and looked at Evelyn. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a small cabin at the back of the estate. When they stepped inside, Evelyn was surprised to see that the cabin was filled with keepsakes, childhood photos of Dylan, old toys, and even letters he had written to his mother as a boy. "This was my retreat," Dylan explained with a nostalgic smile. Evelyn picked up one of the letters and read it silently. In it, a young Dylan had written about his dreams and fears, revealing a vulnerable side of him she had never seen before. "You really are changing," she said, placing the letter back on the shelf. Dylan looked at her, his eyes filled with hope. "I'm trying. For you." Evelyn was silent for a moment before responding. "Maybe there's still a chance for us." The days following their visit to Dylan's cabin were filled with self-reflection and hesitation. Evelyn knew she was approaching an important decision, but the fear of being hurt again held her back. Dylan, on the other hand, seemed more certain than ever about his commitment. He didn't pressure her, but remained present, proving through actions rather than words that he was willing to face any challenge to show his transformation. One evening, as Evelyn was in her studio finishing a painting, Dylan appeared at the door. He held 2 glasses of wine and seemed more at ease than usual. "May I come in?" he asked with a slight smile. Evelyn nodded, and he stepped closer, handing her one of the glasses. They stood in silence for a while, looking at the painting Evelyn was working on, a portrait of a butterfly resting on a flower, its vibrant colors standing out against the soft background. "It's beautiful," Dylan said sincerely. "Thank you," Evelyn replied with a small smile. Dylan took a sip of his wine before speaking again. "I've always been fascinated by a butterfly's transformation. It starts as something so small and confined, but over time, it becomes something completely different." Evelyn glanced at him, understanding the metaphor he was drawing. "And you believe people can change like that?" "I believe they can, if they truly want to," he replied with conviction. She was silent, processing his words. Though she still had doubts, Evelyn couldn't deny that Dylan was different. The next morning, Dylan announced that he had planned a trip. "I want to show you something special," he said mysteriously. Evelyn hesitated, but eventually agreed. A private plane took them to a small mountain village, a peaceful place surrounded by breathtaking landscapes. Upon arrival, Dylan led her to a simple yet cozy house he had prepared especially for the occasion. "Why did you bring me here?" Evelyn asked curiously. Dylan looked around, taking a deep breath. "The fresh air here reminds me that life can be simple yet full of meaning. I wanted us to have a moment away from everything, so we can truly connect." During their stay, Evelyn and Dylan shared moments that once seemed impossible. They walked along nature trails, cooked simple meals together, and talked about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Evelyn began to see a side of Dylan he had hidden for too long, a raw, vulnerable side that moved her deeply. One afternoon during one of their walks, as they rested by the lake, Dylan broke the silence. "Evelyn, I know I still have a lot to prove to you, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, the change in me is real." She looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "And what do you want from me, Dylan?" "Give me a chance," he replied simply. Evelyn felt a lump in her throat. For so long, she had built walls around her heart, but now, standing before Dylan, those walls were beginning to crumble. When they returned to the estate, Evelyn felt different. There was a clarity in her thoughts that she had never had before, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could trust Dylan again. She knew that the final decision had to be made carefully. The morning air was fresh and crisp. The soft sunlight slowly brightened the mansion. Evelyn woke up gradually, golden rays filtering through the slightly parted curtains. Sitting up in bed, she looked around, taking in the peaceful stillness of the house. Something inside her had changed over the past few days. The confusion that had haunted her for so long had begun to fade after their trip to the mountains. She felt as though, despite the walls she had built around her heart finally crumbling, she still remembered every moment she had shared with Dylan. The deep conversations, the effortless laughter, and the constant care he had shown her. They all pointed to a truth she had been afraid to admit. Dylan had truly changed, and she could no longer deny his impact on her life. Evelyn went downstairs for breakfast and found Dylan sitting at the table. He greeted her with a warm smile, setting aside his newspaper the moment he saw her. "Good morning," he said in that gentle voice that had become so familiar lately. "Good morning," Evelyn replied, taking a seat across from him. The silence between them was comfortable. Dylan poured her a cup of coffee, watching as she took her first sip. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't want to push her. After breakfast, Dylan suggested they take a walk in the garden. Evelyn agreed, and together they strolled along the flower-lined path. The quiet was filled with birdsong and the soft rustling of trees in the breeze. When they reached a small stone bench beneath an old tree, Dylan stopped and turned to face her. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something," he said, his tone serious. She looked at him, waiting. "I promised before that I would do everything I could to earn back your trust. I need to know how far I've come." Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question. She met his gaze, seeing both hope and vulnerability in his eyes. "I've changed, Dylan," she admitted. "And yes, you are earning back my trust." Dylan smiled, but there was something else he needed to say. "I have another question," he said, kneeling down on one knee and pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Evelyn gasped in surprise as Dylan opened the box to reveal a simple, yet elegant diamond ring. "Evelyn Nicole Thomas, will you marry me, not because of a contract, but because of love?" His words hung in the air, and Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless, her heart pounding. Finally, she smiled and nodded. "Yes, Dylan, I will." Dylan slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the shade of the tree. It was a simple yet profoundly meaningful moment, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The wedding took place just a few weeks later, in an intimate ceremony in the estate's garden. Only a handful of close friends and partners from their social projects were present, but the love and joy in the air were undeniable. Evelyn wore a delicate lace gown that made her look almost ethereal, while Dylan, in a sharp suit, couldn't take his eyes off her throughout their vows. Holding Evelyn's hands tightly, Dylan spoke with deep emotion. "Evelyn, you have taught me the true meaning of love, patience, and redemption. I promise to stand by you through every moment, good or bad, and dedicate my life to making you happy." With teary eyes, Evelyn responded, "Dylan, you have shown me that people can change, and that love can grow even in the most unexpected circumstances." I promise to love you and stand by you as we build our future together." Applause and smiles from the guests followed. Their kiss. For the first time, they had truly committed to each other. Evelyn felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The first 5 years of their marriage were filled with challenges, but also with joy and growth. Evelyn and Dylan worked tirelessly to expand their social projects, helping hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Their relationship deepened, rooted in trust and genuine love. One morning, while they were in the kitchen preparing breakfast together, Evelyn turned to Dylan with a shy smile. "I have some news for you," she said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Dylan paused what he was doing and looked at her. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Evelyn revealed, her voice filled with emotion. For a moment, Dylan was speechless, but then a radiant smile spread across his face. He stepped closer and pulled her into a tight embrace. "That's incredible, Evelyn," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. This news brought even more joy into their lives, and the following months were spent preparing the baby's room and planning for their future as a family. The day Grace Dylan was born was one of the most emotional moments in Evelyn and Dylan's lives. When they finally held their daughter in their arms, they both felt an instant connection, as if every challenge they had faced in the past had prepared them for that very moment. "She's perfect," Evelyn whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Just like her mother," Dylan replied, gently stroking Grace's head. Grace's arrival strengthened their bond even further, and the mansion, once marked by cold formality, had transformed into a warm and loving home. The following years were filled with achievements. The community center that Dylan and Evelyn had founded became a beacon of hope, helping thousands of people find new opportunities. Evelyn continued to paint, using her art to raise funds for social projects, while Dylan became a mentor to young entrepreneurs determined to make a difference. Grace grew up surrounded by love, her laughter filling their home with joy. Dylan and Evelyn had become true partners in every sense of the word, looking toward the future with hope and gratitude. One evening, as they watched Grace sleep, Dylan took Evelyn's hand and whispered, "You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." Evelyn smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Together, they looked ahead, knowing that no matter what challenges lay in their path, they would always stand by each other, united by the love that had transformed them.